After the Anglo-Irish War that took place from the 21st of January 1919 to the 11th of July 1921, the British Army handed over the Curragh Camp to the Irish Free State Army. The handover took place at 10 a.m. on Tuesday the 16th of May 1922. To commemorate this, Reggie Darling, historian in residence of the Curragh Camp, was interviewed by myself, Liam Geraghty, on behalf of the Curragh Local History Group. I sat down to chat with Reggie in his home on the Curragh in August 2021.
Okay, my name is Reggie Darling. I'm a member of the Curragh Local History Group. I've been asked to give a little talk about the handover to Curragh Camp in 1922.
So I suppose the first thing I wanted to ask is, what was the Curragh like before the handover?
Before the handover, well, I suppose it was a thriving place because the British Army, it was a major base for the British Army in Ireland, the biggest one they had, and in fact for the Empire, because a lot of people came, a lot of regiments done a tour of duty on the Curragh, and like the Empire would have been kind of, at its height at that time. India would have been a place that a lot of them would have gone to, and my own father now, who was in the British Army a little bit earlier than 22. He was in the army in early 22, and he spent most of his time in India with the 12 Royal Lancers. And when the Irish state was set up, the new Irish Army, he, along with a lot of other Irish men, left the British Army to become instructors in the new army.
How did the handover, I suppose, come about in the first place? Like, what led up to it?
Well, the War of Independence, of course, would have been the treaty with Great Britain and Ireland, when they agreed to a treaty, and the Irish Free State was set up, much against the wishes of a lot of Republicans, who the anti-treaty people who objected to it, and that subsequently led to the Civil War.
And so what regiments kind of would have been involved then around that time?
British Army regiments.
Yes, yeah.
Well, I don't really know the names of the regiments, but there were quite a number. Like, they had wound down a bit, like, naturally coming up. They probably knew that the takeover was going to take place, and they had wound down. But there was still a substantial number of troops on the Curragh. There'd probably be in the thousands, and you know.
So when did the Irish troops arrive? So
the Irish troops arrived in the 16th of May 1922, and they were led by General Ginger O'Connell. He was the first GOC of the Curragh Command, and the British officer that handed over the Curragh Camp was Sir Ralph Dalrymple. He was Lieutenant Colonel Sir Ralph Dalrymple. They exchanged pleasantry salutes, and they just marched out. When the British had left, like the day before, and that early morning, in convoys of trucks and armoured cars and whatever they had, and went off. And I suppose the rest of them left by rail. They would have marched to the Curragh siding.
Yeah.
And took the train to Dublin, where they would have embarked in for England, presumably. And of course, some of them, you see, a number of the terms of the treaty were that the British would have a presence in Ireland, and they held on to a number of the ports, and quite a lot of the business people around Kildare, especially in Newbridge, Kildare area, they were horrified at the thoughts of the British leaving, because it meant that their business was gone, more or less. So some of them got up a petition to try and keep the British Army on the Curragh. In other words, that it would become like one of the ports, and that they would hold on to it.
Really?
Yeah. But it didn't happen anyway, so.
I can't imagine it might have gone down too well, with certain people.
No, yeah, but you must remember that the Curragh, that the Kildare area in general, around this area, was kind of, pro-British, because a lot of the families around, including my own, would have been, English. And, you had a lot of names like the Penroses and Malicks and, Darlings and, unusual names that weren't Kildare names, not native Kildare names. They are now, but at that time they wouldn't have been. So
How many troops with the in terms of the Irish troops then? How many?
The Irish troops, there wouldn't have been a huge number.
Yeah.
Just maybe a few hundred.
Yeah.
Just to take over, because they were thinly spread around the place, like,
Yeah.
They would have comprised the former IRA, and I mean there weren't a huge number of them.
Yeah.
But then of course the Irish Army expanded rapidly, because it was a job and there was no work, and lots of people joined the Irish Army then. Then in I suppose 1923-24 there was a huge reduction in the army, and there were cases where people who had been army officers in the army and had been demobbed came back looking to get in as private soldiers. So because work was so scarce.
Yeah.
So it would have. I mean, I forget what the amount of money that was spent in the Kildare area that the British Army would have contributed to, by virtue of the fact that they were buying all kinds of stuff. They had to buy provisions for the troops, and then the troops themselves would have had their own money. They would have spent money locally, and fodder for horses. There were a lot of horses at that time, and farmers would have benefited in a big way from the forage. And also from selling hay. I can remember an old farmer telling me that he used to bring hay up to the camp. He knew the guy in the weighbridge, who would have been a British soldier. Wow. And he'd give him a few bob, and he'd weigh the hay 2 or 3 times. So you might get paid 2 or 3 times for the same day of the hay. All this kind of stuff like that.
A handy number.
He thought that was a patriotic act. He was striking a blow for Ireland by diddling the British Army.
So when was the last time the Union Jack would have been?
Yes, on that day, that very day, and on the 16th of May. And it was traditional for the British Army, and maybe other armies too, to cut down flagpoles so that the people who took over their post, the enemy as it would have been then, couldn't put up their colours until they were well gone out of sight. So they had to kind of get a few Border Works men in and try and improvise and put up a pole, a temporary pole. Or
wow. I
think what they done was they had the tricolour kind of coming over the water tower. Right. There's actually Pate News footage of the handover.
Wow.
Quite good too. You can get it probably on the internet, So it would have been a big day. But I can remember an old lady telling me that she remembers people crying, women crying when they saw the British leaving.
Really?
Yeah,
wow.
Because they thought these lads will be savages and their life will never be the same again. Forgetting, of course, that an awful lot of the British soldiers were Irish anyway.
Yeah.
So,
wow. Was there a separate handover for both sides of the camp?
No, just one. Yeah. The camp was just handed over in fact, and they left it in the British. Now, in fairness to them, they left it in very good order. Everything was set up in the billiard tables in the canteens, the messes, and everything was nice.
Tidied up.
He tidied up,
wow.
yeah, and they would have left a number of vehicles and stuff as well, for the new army, Because I mean, at the time we were still kind of we were just a free state within the Commonwealth. We were like Canada or whatever.
Yeah.
And Australia and these places,
Who would you know the general officer commanding of either side? Who would have been doing the handover?
Well, the handover, as I said, was General O'Connell on the Irish side, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Dalrymple on the British side. He was actually in the American Army, so he was he would have been a well travelled soldier.
Yeah, and respected.
And another little thing was that a few weeks after the handover to Curragh, O'Connell was in Dublin, and he met this former a Republican, a guy who was kind of anti-treaty, and your man arrested O'Connell. And your man O'Connell thought he was joking, and he had a revolver, and he marched him into the forecourts, and they held him in the forecourts, and that was one of the things that precipitated the bombardment of the forecourts, because O'Connell was a great friend of Michael Collins, right. and Collins, gave them an ultimatum to release O'Connell. And a funny thing, O'Connell survived the bombardment, got away. And like he was served as a general in the army, Irish Army, until he retired sometime in the 30s. And he was having a meal one day in the Shelbourne Hotel, and he choked on a piece of meat and died.
Wow.
Wasn't that an ignominious end for a guy who had gone through so much?
Been in the army in America, here in the Handover.
Yeah. Through the Civil War, everything. The bombardment of the forecourt, everything. We got out, so it shows you don't go till your time is up.
That's it. And so I believe you have a bell in the local history from the time.
Well, the bell would have, be from an earlier time. The bell was cast in 1855, which was the time, the year that the Curragh Camp was built and opened. And it would have been an encampment bell, a bell that was specially cast for the Curragh Camp.
Right.
But we don't really know where it was placed. I have an idea that it was up near where the clock tower is, at the back of the clock tower.
Right.
Because from all photographs I can see a kind of a wooden structure that looked like a bell could have been mounted in it, but we don't know really.
Right.
Because it was superseded by a gun. They used to fire a cannon off, and until up in, I don't know when, it went on for a long time anyway, this gun. And it could be heard in Naas, the gun, because it was so loud. So, Well, that was a common thing, because in Malta now, they still do that. The Britishers fire off a gun at certain hours of the day. So,
that's your alarm clock in the morning.
And then of course you had buglers. And then the Irish Army had them as well, and they'd be playing, they'd play Reveille, which was get up in the morning. Then they'd play Cook House. They used to play the Angelus, 12 o'clock. And then at night they'd play Lights Out. So all these fellas, and I can remember those. They went on into the 50s now. They were there,
Do we know who actually hoisted the tricolour then at that time?
I think it was O'Connell.
Would have been O'Connell.
Yeah, himself. Yeah. There are photographs showing him for hoisting it. He was the man, and I think they have the tricolour below in the military museum on the Curragh now.
Right. Yeah.
And they have the last Union flag as well. They have that there as well. So.
Would members of the public have been allowed to come to Handover?
Yeah. There was lots of photographs of civilians and that. So whether there was a big interest or not, I don't know. But there were certainly people there. There's a photograph of them walking up near the water tower there, of O'Connell and Dalrymple and their aides and their civilians and motor cars and things around. So obviously there was some interest in it. It was a particularly wet day as well.
Yeah.
Horrible day, yeah.
Right.
And then there's another photograph. We have them up in our little place, club rooms. There's a photograph of a group of Irish soldiers marching in, and some of them are in civvies and some of them are in half uniform, and they're a tough looking bunch, I can tell you now. Looking at them, I'd say a lot of them were anti-treaty, They seemed to be tough men ready for another fight,
Yeah. Presumably a lot of those civilians and people who attended would have been worried about their future.
Of course they were. Yeah, they were, especially guys working in the what was then the Board of Works, the civilian branch of the Corps of Engineers, because a lot of them lost their jobs. And in Newbridge, you see, Newbridge Barracks too would have been part of the Curragh command, so that was gone as well, and that was a huge camp, big cavalry camp, So it would have devastated the area from that point, from the business point of view,
And would your father or your family kind of have remembered that time, or would they have spoke about it?
No, sure. At that time, my family would have been over 20 years on the Curragh Camp.
Wow.
My grandfather would have had his business there that time, and didn't seem to affect him, and he kept going anyway.
He kept going, yeah.
So, but.
It must have been very empty. Must have felt very empty, I'm sure, for the civilians at the time, from the 20,000 or so soldiers leaving, even if there was only maybe a couple of hundred Irish ones coming in.
Well, you see, there was a kind of a precedent set by the First World War in 1914. Huge numbers left as well, And I remember an old guy telling me like there was nothing left in the Curragh in 1914, you know, nearly just a skeleton staff.
Yeah.
But then by 1916, General Lowe, who took Pádraig Pearse's surrender after the Easter Rising, he left the Curragh with nearly 3,000 troops. So there was, even though it was wartime, there were still a lot of soldiers here.
Yeah.
They were probably reservists or fellas training to go to France and that, like, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
Because
how do you think it changed from, you know, what do you think the big difference would have been for people who, you know, living in the Curragh, you know, after the handover? Like, do you think it would have changed in a big way, or?
Oh no, I say it changed in a huge big way, right. Because I mean all the dependents of the soldiers too that were living there, women and children and things, they all went back to England, and I mean the old military graveyard is testament to that. I mean they're there, and they're the graves are there, never visited by anyone, just a lonely graveyard on the hill there, you know.
Yeah. And
all these English names and little children that were buried there, and you know, women, wives and husbands and things. So it was like, you know, they were just totally uprooted, like, and gone, like, you know.
Yeah.
Because I can remember old guys coming back, you know, they used to come back and they would have gone to school with my father back in the early days of the 20th century, like, you know, and they'd be talking about, you know, these would have been English kids, you know, that went back with their families, and you know, the great old time they had, the same as I had when I was a child. Growing up, it was a great place to grow up in, like, you know, the Curragh Camp.
Yeah.
Great freedom for children, like, you know. And a lot of the old buildings were still there. The old gymnasium, which was down near the squash courts and the ball alleys, and you know, they were still going from the British time, you know.
Yeah.
You know, and the cinemas and Sands home, and you know, there was lots of places. They had the bakery, they had the abattoir. It was a totally. And a swimming pool, which, you know, very few places had swimming pools. Towns, you know, none of the big towns around had swimming pools in.
So you had all the benefits. Like.
Yeah, I think the only town around that I can remember that had a swimming pool was Portarlington, and that was because I think it was Odlums or not Odlums. It was some other big company that had it for their employees, and it's still there. And there used to be swimming galas in the Curragh, and I remember they used to come from Portarlington. And I remember on one occasion, maybe many occasions, but on one particular one, I remember in the late 40s, a crowd came from the RUC. They competed in a swimming gala on the Curragh Camp, like, yeah. So,
wow.
But you know, and that swimming pool is it's gone now, but there's a new one there now in this place. But no, so you had everything that you wanted on the Curragh.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
You had Eason's, you know, the bookstore. You had a shop called Todd Burns. It was a big department store. They had a chemist shop. They had a drapery shop. They had a grocery shop, and they had a chemist shop or a hardware shop, all under the one roof.
Yeah.
And that store was burnt down in 1960. Actually, it went and burnt. Remains of it. So.
How much has the Curragh changed? You know, since you were growing up. Which, you know, how long after, you know, you growing up in the Curragh would the handover have happened? Maybe.
Well, I suppose when I was a child in the 1940s. Now, you know, my earliest memories would be kind of from the mid 1940s. Like, you know, maybe 1903, maybe 43, 44. Like, you know.
Yeah.
Around that time when I was started school in 1944, I'd say, in primary school. You know, they'd be my year. And at that time, the Curragh was throbbing, packed with soldiers, because it was the emergency years. And all the married quarters were filled with soldiers. All the wives and children of the soldiers had to leave the Curragh. Because, first of all, it was dangerous, because they thought it could be bombed. And anyway, they wanted the accommodation for troops. So I can remember McDonough and Pierce, all those billets, or all those married quarters were billets for troops, you know, soldiers in them. And there was very few. When I started school, there were only 3 school teachers, and there was only a handful of children living in the camp, families. And they were families of many of what used to be called key personnel, people that were needed, and they allowed them to stay. You had electricians and plumbers and carpenters, various people like that, and a few soldiers that were allowed, and so there was very few children. And then in 1945, when the emergency was over, there was a huge influx then of people. The Curragh mushroomed up, everywhere was packed with people, and from all over Ireland, where their fathers would have been, transferred back to the Curragh, and so it was strange, and that kind of lasted, and into the 50s. Then the Curragh went into the doldrums a bit. It got really, it was depressing, and there was very very little money around. And in 1960, then when overseas service started with the Congo, it kind of came up again a bit, But after that, then people started to leave the Curragh. Families, they got houses out around the periphery of the Curragh, and the all-Mary quarters then were neglected, and the Department of Defence didn't do anything to encourage people to stay, and they wanted them out. In fact, a soldier could get a grant of 10,000 if he left. Now that didn't alone apply to soldiers. I mean, prison officers and guards also got that if they were in a state house. They wanted them out.
And what did they want them, to do with them?
They wanted them out because it was too expensive to maintain the houses.
Right.
So they just wanted to knock the houses down or sell them off if they could.
Yeah.
But obviously you couldn't sell the houses in the Curragh Camp off because in the middle of it. But they did sell Orchard Park off.
Right.
Which is it's outside, but they were but they were built as Mary quarters as well,
Yeah.
So,
what do you think the future of the Curragh is? I suppose now after all that.
The future of the Curragh, I think the Curragh will just, at the moment it seems to be in the doldrums. I have no connection with it anymore, and it's depressing for me to look at it,
Yeah.
It's like the old song. Sadly, I wander through scenes of my childhood. It's really terrible. You'd see people during the lockdown there. We used to go, Catherine, my wife, and myself, used to go for a walk around the Curragh, and we'd meet other people of our age, and they'd be nearly crying, when they'd see the place, the lapidation,
Yeah.
I mean, it's a scandal to see a beautiful building like the post office just neglected there. And other buildings as well around, and they're just falling down.
Yeah.
And I mean, they could have got the money. The money was there during the boom times, but for some reason they didn't want to do anything with it,
And then just on the, I suppose, on the handover, what do you think? I suppose the legacy of the handover was, for the Curragh's history.
Well, I suppose for the. I mean, it became the main base for the Irish Army, the new Irish Army, and a lot of fine people went through the Curragh Camp. There were great characters over the years that were there, and great families. I can remember some great families, very, very good, nice people, and I suppose. It was inevitable once the truce or the treaty was signed that the Curragh would become the main centre for the Irish Army,
Yeah.
And but of course, you see, the Irish Army they inherited the barracks of an army of occupation. They had too many barracks. They didn't need them. And you could have had the whole army on the Curragh Camp.
Yeah.
You could still do that, and you could deploy them quickly if you had, say, helicopters and things. You could deploy them anywhere, and you'd save an awful lot of money. But anyway, the powers that be have ideas.
How do you think the soldiers, leaving, at the handover, how do you think they felt about it?
Well, I'd say some of them. They left the army and stayed on and got jobs around. I can remember a good few of them.
Yeah.
That stayed on, and
they enjoyed it so much.
Yeah, and there doesn't appear to have been any animosity towards them.
Yeah.
They were That's one of the things I can remember. Like you say, growing up on the Curragh with a name like Reggie Darling, you'd imagine you'd be the brunt of bullying and stuff like that. But never. They're just normal, like, yeah.
I think that speaks, I think, to, you know.
Well, it does.
The people of the Curragh.
Yeah, and Kildare. I can remember a guy, an old sergeant major. And he said Kildare is the best county in Ireland, because we said we're all blow-ins in Kildare, and everyone is a blow-in. So there's no, you know, the people wouldn't be jealous of somebody coming in and getting a job or getting whatever.
Yeah.
Compared to other parts of the country, I suppose.
Yeah.
But that's probably because of the fact that it was a military county, and then of course the horse racing industry as well, is it?
Yeah.
You know, you'd have people from all over. All over the world and all over Europe.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, that's kind of it. Thanks very much, Reggie.
You're welcome, and I hope it's of some use to you.
Brilliant.
The Curragh Local History Group would like to acknowledge the support of Kildare County Council and the Kildare Decade of Commemorations support of this project.